If you did so before 3:45, you should have received an acknowledgement. If you've done so and have not received an acknowledgement, it was probably after 3:45. If not, double check with me at the end of class. As I said, if you submitted it after 3:45, I had to shut down my email, so I didn't see it quite yet. But I'll acknowledge it tomorrow morning. Okay, so we went through what is probably the most challenging segment of the course last week, and we'll finish it up today. Any questions so far about legislative history? The goal is to have an overall understanding of the process and what the documents are, and at the end of class, we'll talk about overall strategy. So how to apply that knowledge when you do have to do legislative intent research. We will also have time to finish up the federal workshop, Federal Legislative History Workshop at the end of class. Okay, so if there are no questions, we will dive in and talk about state legislative history. Everybody have a handout, another walkthrough, this time for state. Pass around, anybody need? Oh, here. I'm just going to pass around the whole pile. Whatever's left is left. Okay, basically, this is a review of what we talked about last week because the concepts are essentially the same. As I like to say, the names have just been changed around a little bit. The other thing about state legislative history that is very different than federal is that there are far fewer documents. So while the process, the concept is the same, the documents produced are typically much fewer, also with different names. So the challenge is going to be for any given state figuring out what documents are produced and then how to find them. One particularly very useful source for that is on page 1 of our walkthrough, and it's this website. It's a library research guide put together by a librarian, as you can see, the Jerome Hall Law Library. And what she has done is put together legislative history research guides for the different states. So we can see, if you wanted to investigate New York, basically just click on the state. Alex, we're not going to talk too much about Louisiana, so you might want to click on Louisiana, because today we're going to be focusing on New York. Let's see, nope, that's Louisiana, so we can go back so you can get a refresher on New York. One other thing I'll mention at the moment, if I haven't in our first couple of classes, or I'll repeat it if I have, depending on what you wind up doing for practice, wherever you are, you might find it useful to search out and find your state's legal research guide. Some states have more than one. In fact, here in New York, we have a couple. This one is a little bit of investment. There's actually an alternative, actually authored by our library director, Dean Selby. If you wind up doing a lot of state research and you wind up having less straightforward questions, by less straightforward I mean legislative history, or I mean having to do with your state's administrative materials, which we'll talk about when we talk about administrative materials, it can come in really useful. So if you do find yourself doing a legislative history research for New York or any other state, remember these research guides exist. There are some great ones on the web, as we're seeing reference to here, but sometimes the good old-fashioned print, having a print volume handy, might be useful. Believe it or not, I still, even though I've done this for many, many years, I still check that now and again when just a weird question comes up that I just plain don't know. Okay, so as I said, this is pretty much a review. So the first step, if you are looking at a New York State statute section and you're wondering what on earth did the legislature mean by the particular language in this code section. So anybody remember the first thing we need to figure out when we are looking for the legislative history of a particular section? Chapter law number. So here I am. I'm going to go to our favorite New York section. Remember our little shortcut here on Westlaw. If I type in the state abbreviation and ST, I go to the statutes, And it brings up the list of different codes, and on the right here, I have my template. So if we're looking for public health, 4410, somewhere in here we'll see public health. And that works for any state. So where do we find the chapter number? The bottom. Westlaw, they're called credits. Anybody remember what it's called in Lexis? History, exactly. Okay, and so here we see that our law was added by Chapter 938 in 1976. But if we are interested in what we see, it's amended. What if we are interested in Section 4, some language here in Section 4? How do we know which of these chapters to check?
You can search the amended, click on the link, hyperlink to the amended chapter law and see what the text says.
Well, you can see what the chapter says, but how does that tell you what the intent of the legislature was in the various documents that were produced? You'll see the chapter, you'll see the end result of those documents. Just like we look in committee reports and possibly congressional record and all those documents we talked about last week. But what did we look in the federal? When we were looking at a federal code section and we looked at the credits and we saw all the different public laws, how did we figure out which public law might have changed or added what we are interested in?
Look at the annotated section, the amendments.
Remember the editor and reviser's notes? In the print, it's called historical and statutory notes. So again, if we were interested in subsection 4 of our code section, can you read it? No, you probably can't read it from the back there. So let's make it bigger. This work? Yay, that works. Can you read that now? We were interested in subdivision 4. What are we going to? Of? What year? 96. You need both. Just like public laws, you need the year and the public law number. Actually, you have the full public law number, less so. But for chapters, the chapter starts over at 1 every year in New York. And that's typically the case in most states, whatever they call their chapters. Sometimes they're public acts, like a... So this historical and statutory notes tell me, if you're interested in subdivision 4, it was added by this Chapter 705 in 1996. So let's take a look at that. Well, let's take a look at that online. So from there, here on Westlaw, now that we know we want Chapter 705, we can go ahead and click on it. And just like we did with the public law, go to the Legislative History Materials tab. And again, you want to make sure, because sometimes you get more than one chapter here. I'm not quite sure why that is, but you want to make sure you're clicking on our chapter, and we go to something called a bill jacket. That's what New York calls its collection of legislative history materials. So what you are looking for in New York is a bill jacket. If you're in Louisiana, New Jersey, Connecticut, it's going to be called something different, or they may not have a whole collection. You may have to find each document. That's why you want to go to that Indiana website, this one, and figure out what your state needs. But we now know we need a bill jacket. And a bill jacket is just a collection of the different documents that are available. So here we see the form that they filled out to introduce it. There's a memorandum filed by the Senate entitled an act, and it was a description of the bill, this landmark bill, part of my legislative program. Here's a bill report, summary of the provisions, talks about utilization review, remember that term? And then legislative history, new legislation, arguments in support. So here we get to that whole legislative intent concept, which is why you do legislative history research most of the time. The arguments in support. So this is why the person introduced this particular bill that became a chapter law. Here's a memorandum. Again, more purpose. And just a whole bunch of different documents. I'm not going to stand here and read through all of them. Another statement in support. So this is where you would get that information. Okay. Getting to this point, so basically in New York, what you're looking for ideally is a bill jacket. Pretty straightforward, not always straightforward in practice, as we'll see in a moment. But let's take a look at McKinney's in print so you'll at least be refreshed, have your memory refreshed on how to get to this information. So on page 2 of our walkthrough, it's just our standard McKinney's black volume. Didn't bring that up today, but we saw it last time. And this is the same page we saw when we looked at New York statutes. Here's good old 4410. And turning the page, on page 4, now it's not called credits in print, it's just the parenthetical after the text of the statute, just like it's history on Lexis. Every resource seems to have a different name. And again, we see that it was added in 1976 by Chapter 938. Everybody see that? I won't make you do the routine again. One piece of strategy, though, that again I'll go over at the end, it is important to understand when your section was first, not when, but when and by what chapter or public law your section was first enacted, because much of it that still exists today, that might be the chapter of the public law that you need to research. It may be, like in my hypothetical today, it's a later amendment, but a lot of the time it's going to be that first one. So you check the historical and statutory notes, also known as the editor and reviser's notes, to see, do I have to check the first one or do I have to check an amendment? So again, as you can see back on page 4, our all-important chapter law numbers. So as we discovered, 1996 chapter 705 is of interest, and we discovered that by the historical and statutory notes. That's what it's called in print. Again, remember, editor and advisor's notes we just saw on Westlaw. And we saw in this first entry, the subdivision 4, 1996, chapter 705, section 5, effective 1996, added subdivision 4. So we were looking at subdivision 4 of 4410, and we thought, what on earth does that particular language mean? For the legislative intent, we would need to go to chapter 705. Any questions? And of course, what do we need to do? Update, absolutely. Page 5 is the pocket part, but we would discover, if we were looking in McKinney's in print, turning to page 6, that the pocket part does not contain any new chapter law references. So we know we are good for subdivision 4. It was added by chapter 705, so that's the bill jacket we have to find. And if we're really lucky and we have Westlaw, we get to it by clicking on the chapter law number and then clicking on the legislative history materials tabs and then going to the bill jacket. However, you may not all have Westlaw available. Or you may find out, because I know that this is the case in some places, bill jackets are not part of your plan because they're super expensive on Westlaw. I saw some quote somewhere, if they're not part of the plan, bill jackets are one of the more expensive parts of Westlaw to get at if they're not included in your contract. So it may be that you need to find the bill jacket elsewhere. Fortunately for some bill jackets, you can get them on the web for free. through the New York State Archives, as you can see. And I gave you a printout of that on page 7. So let's see, do I have that? So this page has a slight twist on how to find it. So if you were to Google New York bill jackets, because that's what you want to find, you have to remember that name, bill jackets. Or if you went to that Indiana site or any other site, you'd see a reference, New York, go to see the bill jacket. And you get that right up top on Google, good old Google, you get the Vito Recall Jackets New York State Library. That sounds nice. It brings you to this page. I don't know why it does that. What you need to know, and I don't know a better way to make this simpler or more intuitive, what you need to know is to go to this digital collections link. Like I said, that's just one of those things they don't make easy. Not everything on the web is as easy as one would hope. And here's the page that we were at, and that's also reproduced on page 7. So now that we know our all-important chapter law number as well as the year, we know that it was 1996, so we are lucky that it's there. Note that online the jackets only go through 2014. So this is one drawback to this free site, is that if you've got a chapter law from 2015, 2016, going forward, or prior to 1995, you have to go elsewhere. Westlaw's coverage is a little bit better. Actually, I'm not even sure, but I would go here first. It's free, obviously. If you can't find it here, then you, again, check Westlaw if it's available to you. Otherwise, you would have to call a New York law library to see if they have the bill jackets. We have them, actually we don't have them going forward, but we have them going back a little bit before 1995. So just so you can see what getting there looks like at this site. Another trick is you actually want to go to the sub-collection. I don't know why they give you a link to the parent collection. That brings us back to the page we were just at. And here at the sub-collection for 1996, it's just in bill number order. So we would need to just click on next till we get to chapter 705. This first page is chapter 48. So I could click on next a whole bunch of times, but I'm not going to make you sit and watch me do that. I pulled it up already. And once you click on chapter 705, here's the bill jacket, which is essentially what we just saw on Westlaw. Yeah, Westlaw is a little bit easier, and again, if it's part of your plan, by all means, that's a great way to get to it. But if not, either it's not in your plan or you don't even have Westlaw, this is going to be the best source. So any questions about bill jackets, what they are, why you care, most importantly, and then how to get there? Okay. Basically, with regard to Lexis and Bloomberg, again, I probably shouldn't say this, especially when we're being recorded, but they're not nearly as good. Lexis would especially hate to hear me say that. So just to show you quickly, again, to get to our New York statute section, just go to codes and go to our state so we get that nice template, because I don't remember how they abbreviate all their codes, and it's always different between services. So again, as we reviewed on Lexis, we find our all-important chapter law in our history. We can go to the chapter law, and as you notice, we have all our chapter laws. Now, we already know we're interested in Chapter 705, but if we didn't know that, I don't understand this either, but Lexis doesn't always have a complete historical or statutory notes or editor or reviser's notes, whatever it is you want to call it. I don't know why they don't have it for this section. Interestingly, they do have it for other sections. So, oh, I'm sorry, where I want to go is Article 44. I was investigating and I happened to notice the other section we were looking at, 4406. If you go to history, again, we have the editor's notes, and here it does it in reverse chronological, well, actually does it in chronological order, but it lets us know what the different chapter laws that amended ours did. I don't even see 705. That's kind of interesting, too. So, a little sketchy there on Lexis. And if you would go to a particular chapter law number, you don't really get the bill jacket. You get bill tracking. We talked about bill tracking, remember, is the other reason to do legislative history research if you want to find what's happening with a particular bill that's been introduced in this session or what happened to a particular bill that got introduced in prior years. And I'll show you how to do bill tracking for New York, and it's going to be similar for other states in a little while. So Lexis, not great. Similarly, Bloomberg. Any questions about Lexis now that I'm dissing it on tape? Bloomberg also, they have even less information regarding chapter laws and statutory notes. I can show you Bloomberg has nothing, or you can take my word for it. You tell me. I figured that's what you'd say. Okay. All right, so bill jackets is going to be the first place you're going to look in New York. The next place you need to look in New York, and if you remember, or maybe not, when we first started talking about legislative history last week, we were looking at the Chase Scientific case, and I told you about my theory of I thought there was an enterprising associate who went back and did legislative history research and discovered the winning argument for their client. And what that enterprising associate looked at, if you might remember, was a revision of the entire CPLR in New York. New York has certain codes like the CPLR that are overall statutory schemes for a particular area of the law, like civil practice. Another one would probably be criminal procedure. When those overall schemes get changed, in many, many different sections, they get renumbered, everything gets changed. When that happens in something like the CPLR, there might be issued a legislative report. So here I'm at the New York State Assembly homepage, the website. You guys just Google New York State Assembly. Probably put in legislative reports and you'd get there. Now, not a whole lot online, as you can see. You can see if you look at prior years, there's maybe one or two here. So what's available online isn't great. Those legislative reports are something that you really need to just track down in a good old-fashioned law library. I don't even know, I'm not sure they exist electronically anywhere beyond what you might, the couple that you're going to find at this site. So that enterprising associate, either hypothetical or real, I'm not sure which, went to a good old-fashioned law library and found it in good old-fashioned print, like I like to say, and looked through that report for, and what those reports are basically recommendations by commissions on how they think that the law should change to become more modern and address certain issues that have come up over the years. Doesn't happen very frequently, doesn't happen with nearly every section. The one thing I will say, McKinney's will often refer you to that if you read those notes carefully. So the amendments and the editor's reviser's notes. I don't have, let's go to history and go to our section. So this is, you won't see it here because this wasn't revised in an overall legislative initiative for this particular area of law, but you would find them, you would find those notes either in the credits or you would find them in the editor's and reviser's notes. There would be a reference, see legislative report. So important to look for depending again on what the code section is that you are looking at. Any questions? Okay, so as I mentioned, bill jackets aren't always available. Past 2014, I'm not sure bill jackets exist. So if you need to do legislative intent research, there is one other resource, well, I shouldn't say one, there's one other online resource. We'll look at print resources in just a moment. And that's back at this New York State Assembly website. You notice this legislative info. We had taken a look at this laws category a couple of different times. We looked at, this is where you find the New York statutes. It's not McKinney's, but it's where to find it online. So, Alex, if you're down in Louisiana and you don't have access to it on Lexis or Westlaw, or it's out of your plan, this is where you might want to go. Likewise, you all, if for whatever reason you don't have access to the, can't imagine why that would be, but anyway. The other aspect of this website is the lists. We looked at this briefly when we talked about New York statutes, because this is where the chapters, remember our chapter laws, the laws as they, once they are enacted by the legislature, and as I said, this is a funky site because you have to kind of, you have to go to lists, you have to go to chapters, and eventually you click through and it comes up. So here's the list for 2018. What you can also do is look at chapters from prior years. If you already know your all-important chapter law number, which we do. So if we were to go to chapter number we know for, now we're 1996. Actually, let's also click more information. Let's try that again. As we saw, it doesn't always come up the first time. So here we get more information, and if you were to scroll down, you would essentially find one piece of legislative history, which is the sponsor's memorandum. So the sponsor of the bill telling you why he or she thinks it's a great idea. And that tends to be toward the bottom here. Now, of course, introducer's memorandum in support. There we go. Now, of course, we already found this in the bill jacket, so you really wouldn't do this for something where you found the bill jacket. What you would do it for is something you didn't find the bill jacket. So I found an example that isn't on our subject, but from 2016. So again, bill jackets for the moment only go through 2014. Every couple of years, they seem to add a couple of years. So hopefully that will continue to be true. So here, 2016, I just picked a random number here. And it's pretty much going to look the same. And again, if you scroll down, you should hopefully, if you're lucky, find a sponsor's memorandum. Now, that's not nearly as complete as what you find in a bill jacket, but it's better than nothing. Okay. Question? Now, as I mentioned, this is what's available online. There are also sources in print, and if you do need, and interestingly, the sources in print are more current than the bill jackets are online. Don't know why that is, but for the moment, that is the case. So if we turn to page 10 on the walkthrough, page 9 is just, or rather pages 8 and 9 are just screenshots of what we just saw. So you remember our friend McKinney's. So remember there were two versions of McKinney's, and I made a big fuss over looking at the color and the spine, because the black McKinney's is actually the code where we find the laws of the state of New York, or one of the places. The red McKinney's that actually says McKinney's on the spine, and lots of people get confused about, are the session laws, the chapter laws. And we all know what those are these days. So we looked at the first volume where we found our chapter law. So if we were interested in chapter 705 of 1996, it would be here in volume 1. You could actually see on the spine the chapter numbers listed that's covered by this volume. However, if you look at volume 2, and we see on page 10 of the walkthrough volume 1, and we turn to page 11, we would see the content of volume 1, which again is chapter 705. So we see that on page 11, And on page 12, we see Section 5. Remember, we saw in the credits that Section 5 was actually the section of Chapter 705 that changed our Section 4410. So that's page 12. Page 13 is Volume 2, which is now what I'm holding up. Or actually, that's not true. Now I'm holding up Volume 2. And what you find in Volume 2 is some amount of legislative history that gets produced so you can find it. And as I said, McKinney's is actually, we have McKinney's through either 16 or 17, so it's more up to date than the bill jackets are online. So what we would do in Volume 2 is we would look at the top, just like you can see the handy-dandy arrow on page 14, and we would just look at the top till we found Chapter 705. You just flip the pages, as you can see on page 14, till we find 705, and then we would see the memorandum in support. Again, we already found that, but if you weren't able to find that, you could go to McKinney's in print. And as I said, this is going to be very useful if your chapter law is after 2014. And again, page 15 is just more of the memorandum in support. And page 16 is the same thing continued. Now, one other print source, I'll pass these around if anybody's interested in getting to know both volumes of McKinney's. Actually, before I pass this around, does this arrangement where the session laws are in Volume 1 and the legislative history in later volumes, does that remind anybody of anything we've seen before? It's a trick question, but it's not an easy one.
Can you repeat the question?
So we have the session laws in the first volume of McKinney's, and we have legislative history for those session laws in later volumes. Does that remind you of another resource we looked at? And if so, which one? Well, the resource I'm thinking of does contain federal session laws. Close. What's the other planet that USCAN? USCAN does the same thing. It's organized by year, just like McKinney's session laws. The early volumes contain the public laws, the session laws. Remember, session laws is just the generic name for public laws as well as for chapter laws. And then the later volumes contain the selected legislative history documents, both published, not surprisingly, by the same publisher. Not that important, but I find when I can put things in a context, I understand it better. So if any of you benefit the same way, then that's a good thing. So there's McKinney's Volume 1 and 2 if you are interested in the actual hard copy. One other place here in New York that you can find legislative history in print, also more up to date than the bill jackets online, and that's called New York State Legislative Annual, which you can see on page 17 of our walkthrough. The latest we received, I just looked at the shelves today, is 2016. So as I said, a little more up to date. And turning to page 18, now again looking at the chapter law that we've already seen, 705 from 1996, we can see that we find the Governor Program Bill Memorandum. Now probably we would have found that in the bill jacket, but notice it's not the same thing as what we found in Volume 2 of McKinney's session laws. We are on page 18 of the walkthrough. So there is a value to checking the New York Legislative Annual in addition to McKinney's session law if you need to be looking in print. Both of these, by the way, we will be doing a workshop shortly with both of these. They're down in the library quite close to the, right next to McKinney's statutes. At least these volumes are. And page 19 is just that particular memorandum continued. And page 20 is one more document for Chapter 705. And again, you just find it it's in chapter number order, so it's easy enough to find. Again, I know not ideal, but I find this is one interesting case where the print is more up to date than online. That's not usually what happens, but apparently occasionally it does. Okay, any questions about legislative history in print? Again, why you care, always the most important question. Or finding. So last thing you might want to know about, if you happen to be in an organization that has the resources, there is actually an organization here in New York called the New York Legislative Service. They will compile a legislative history for you for any New York State statute. Particularly useful if you have a New York State statute that you're researching that's from like 1873 or something super old that you're not going to find online or anywhere locally. But again, it is a service, so they charge. If you are somewhere that has the resources, that's great. But it's not something that may be available to everybody. And the last thing I am going to talk about before we break for said workshop is bill tracking. Remember, that's the second reason you might do legislative history research, and it's the far easier one. And just as it's far easier in the federal world, it's far easier in, I think, most states, and New York definitely being the case. And again, here at our New York State Assembly website, in that Bill Search and Legislative Info heading, here we have New York State Bill Search. So if you have a particular bill and you're wondering what happened to it, which is what bill tracking is all about, you just need to enter your bill number. Here, for whatever reason, in New York, you need to go to the advanced search, and then you can search Senate bills. If you know the Senate bill, you can probably search it from the home page too, but I like to point out the advanced search because you think you're at the Assembly site and you think, okay, what do I do about a Senate bill? Well, this is the answer. And then you can put in your bill number. You can actually search for text. So if, just to show you what results might look like, I'll search a very generic term. And here you see the results of the bills, since I kept it to this year. So here are the bills introduced in the Senate that mention the word health. Any questions about bill tracking in New York or other legislative history, state legislative history, or other questions? Okay, so what we are going to do is to go down into the library. I've reserved a few tables, and we're going to look at some New York State legislative history. You will need your laptops because this is a combined online and print workshop. I will ask you to split yourself. Let's see, how many people are here today? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15, 16. So we will need groups of 3. Does that work? And one group will have to be 4. I think that works. Do the math. So 4 groups of 3 is 12, and 1 group is 4 groups of 3 is 12, and 1 group is 16. So there's actually 5 groups. That still works. Okay, so we'll go down. The tables that we're using are the tables right by the reference desk because that's where the print materials are. Again, bring your laptops. And then for those who need time, we will finish the federal workshop.
That's the one from last week.
One from last week, yeah. So some of you I know finished. You're welcome to stay around and work on your assignment 3, which is also going to get distributed. Actually, I'll do that first before we finish up the workshop. Okay, so the wrap-up of legislative history, I threw a whole lot at you. So I'm hoping to give you a context now and how to think about that and how to approach it. As I mentioned when we first started, many of you will not have to use this in the course of your practices, but I'm guessing a few of you might, which is why, as I said, we still cover it. So the first thing you want to do, should you run across a question where you're asked, what on earth did the legislature mean by this particular section and this particular code section, is you need to figure out how much time and resources you have to spend. And this, frankly, is true for any research project, not just legislative history, but especially true for legislative history, because as you can see, you can spend a lot of time on it. Is this just a quick, I just need to see if I can find this quick kind of research, or is this a, I really need to suss out what the legislature meant? My hypothetical enterprising associate that we talked about in the Chase Scientific research, he or she was in the long research category. So once you've figured that out, whether it's a short project or a long project, what's the first piece of information you need to find? What do I keep on calling it? The all-important either public law number, if you're federal, or chapter law number, if you're New York. Basically, the all-important session law number. Remember, session law is just a generic term. And in order to find that all-important public or chapter law number, what's the section we check in either on Lexis or Westlaw? Creditor history. And we want to find which public law number there or chapter law number there. I touched on this admittedly, so this is not maybe not so clear. That's why we do a review. So let's go to our ever favorite section, USCA 29 USCA 1144. So here's our section. If we want to figure out the intent of any particular subsection of this section, which all-important public law number enacted it? The first one, good old 93406. Everybody following? So it's very possible that's the all-important public law number we need. However, if it were changed by the amendments, then it may be any of these others. So how do we determine whether it was changed by an amendment or we need to check the first one? Good enough. Historical and statutory notes if you're in print, editor and reviser's notes if you're here on Westlaw. And they're actually, they look the same pretty much. Remember, you want to, and actually when you go, interestingly, when you go to the editor and reviser's notes on Westlaw, they name the section historical and statutory notes. So they're the same thing, they just use two different names. Again, I don't know why. You want to scroll past, well, see here they mention those legislative reports, so you may want to look at these, but to find what each amendment did, you want to get down to amendments. So that at least makes sense, I hope. And you look through and you see that 2006 amendments added subsection E. So if that was the subsection we were interested in, if the text in that section was what we were interested in researching, we would want to make sure to check amendment from 2006, Public Law 109-280. And scrolling down and looking through, you would see, again, depending on your section and subsection, you would be able to see what the amendments did, how they affected your section. So you'd probably be looking at an amendment as well as the original public law or chapter law that enacted your section. Okay, so that you need to do regardless of whether you have just an hour or two or whether you have days and days to do legislative history research. If you only have an hour or two, what is the best type of document to look at for legislative intent for federal purposes now? It's not bad, but there's a better one. Conference report is one type of committee report. So remember, there are all these different committees in Congress on education, on health, on defense, you name it, subject area. So the different committees that the bill covers, the different subject areas that the bill covers, gets referred out to the various subject area committees that are appropriate. So it could be multiple committees, like ERISA got farmed out to the tax committee because it had a lot of tax provisions, got farmed out to the health committee because it had to do with health insurance, and labor, because ERISA essentially had to do with benefits provided by employers. So it goes to those different committees. And those committees, if they decide, hey, this is a good idea, and they vote to report on the bill, so they vote to continue the bill in its process, they issue a report. That's going to be those reports and the appropriate one for your subject area. So we would want to be looking for our client. We would want to be looking in the committees on labor, maybe on health, probably not so much on tax because we're not really interested in the tax aspects. It's also possible we would want to look in the conference report. Anybody remember what the conference report does? Essentially, after it goes through the process in both chambers, the House and the Senate, if they wind up with different versions, they can't present two versions to the president, right? They have to consolidate. So they have to negotiate a single version, and then they produce a conference report, basically reporting on what they decided on, considered and decided on within the conference. So the conference report will be good too if it's an issue they considered during the conference. If it's an issue both chambers agreed on initially, they're not really going to discuss it in the conference report. So again, the conference report, the committee reports and conference report. If you only have a couple of hours to do legislative history research, the committee reports and conference reports are going to be the best place. So for example, there are a number of different ways to get to them. So here actually on Westlaw, I'm actually going to go back to the document and we'll look at our enacting legislation. So again, by enacting legislation, 93-406, it's the first chapter or public law that enacts. And then to get to whatever is available on Westlaw, the Legislative History Materials tab, I'm going to scroll down to Reports. So unfortunately, Westlaw doesn't tell me which committees issued these reports. It does say conference report, so I'd probably want to look at that. But let's just take a look at one. So in the report, I could do, at least here on Westlaw, I could do a couple of things. I could do a keyword search or Control-F search for a particular language that I'm interested in. The other thing I would definitely want to do is to look at the section by section analysis. There usually is one in committee reports, but I'm sure somebody's going to find one that there isn't one, because there's no rule that always applies. But the section by section analysis, look, it tells us purposes, right? Intent. It tells us about definition. Problem with Westlaw, notice tabular or graphic material set forth is not displayable. That's one disadvantage of finding stuff on Westlaw, and Lexis, honestly. But it goes section by section, like the name says, and tells us what they intended with each section. So you want to look in the reports, in the committee reports, in the conference reports, for text that talks overall what Congress intended to do, and then section by section. So that's if you don't have a whole lot of time. If you don't, you can also find committee reports for free. Remember our friend Congress.gov. And again, if you're doing legislative intent research, you have your all-important public law number. Now, Congress.gov covers Congress, different for the states, as we just looked at. So for Congress, we go to our all-important public law number, and maybe, hopefully, our public law is here, and we just made it in with 93-406, again, 93rd Congress. and getting to our all-important public law number. And what Congress.gov. So here's an example for an older, remember our 93-406 public law was enacted in 1974, so we don't have links, unfortunately, so we would need to try to find these elsewhere. So the one we were looking at in Westlaw actually was this one referred to here. So Westlaw is one answer. Finding older committee reports is a little tricky. Typically, actually, Hein Online is a good resource. So if you know your House report number, you could probably find it on Hein Online. Also, ProQuest. Yeah.
How do you feel about just Google?
Yeah, that works too.
I know for like my note, I did that a lot because it was just generally there as a PDF somewhere.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. I stand corrected. I should have said Google first by all means because that's easiest, but you may not always find Google. In fact, I can say for sure you will not always find Google because I work with a lot of journal students who are looking for House reports from way back when and they're not finding it on Google. And then we have to go through these other routes. So definitely I feel great about Googling it if you find it. Okay, so back here on Congress.gov, so here's an example. You're not going to find the link for more recent public laws. You will probably be more lucky and find links here for the committee reports. Okay. And again, remember what we just talked about for New York. New York, we're looking for bill jackets. We're also looking for those legislative reports, which you hopefully will see a reference to in this code section itself, or just after the code section. And for other states, there's that wonderful Indiana legislative history guide. And if you can just remember to Google State Legislative History Research Guide, you'll come across this pretty easily. Okay, so look for the committee reports for federal statutes if you just need really quick legislative history research. If you need more in-depth legislative history research, then you'll want to look for a compiled legislative history. And as it turns out, Westlaw actually does, for some public laws, Westlaw does both. So we could have just come down to the reports here, or if we had kept on going, we would have seen compiled history. And what that tells me is somebody went and found all the documents. So they found the reports, they found the congressional record. Remember, a congressional record equals what? No. Debates. Congressional record, it's where you find the debates of Congress. I ask you that because when I pass around the assignment in a few minutes, you will see references to debates, and you're going to want to write down whatever you find in the congressional record. So our compiled legislative histories compiles reports, compiles conference reports, compiles debates, compiles the bills, has the public laws, has whatever hearings. Sometimes you will see hearings referred to as transcripts. So that's why I wanted to nip that in the bud, so hopefully you don't get confused. In fact, Westlaw is usually, we don't see it here, but Westlaw is usually the one that refers to hearings as transcripts. Okay, so compiled legislative history, if you really need to do in-depth. Maybe you'll find it on Westlaw, and problem with Westlaw, so they divide it up into 3 parts, so you would need to go to each of the 3 parts to do your in-depth research, although actually this one looks like. But the nice thing about, and the problem is, so here you see congressional record, you see HR, remember HR is abbreviation to a bill, not House report. When you do see House report, it's HRPT. So the problem with this is you can't search Westlaw. You have each and every PDF. That would take an awful long time to click through and look at or search through. So we have a couple of alternatives. To me, the best alternative is Hein Online. if you're lucky and Hein Online has your public law. Hein Online does not have every single public law. But if you're lucky and it does, that's going to be the best place. So here on the home page, we just try to remember U.S. federal legislative history. And again, since we already have our all-important public law number, that's why I keep on calling it that, we just need to find our way through. And you can search or just scroll, whichever is easier. So here we have ERISA. We have a 22-volume version, a 3-volume version. I'll go with the 22 for now. And then we can do our search for whatever your term is. And the nice thing about Hein Online, unlike Westlaw that had all those PDFs that you'd have to open each individually to search, I've just searched all 22 volumes. Now I have to look at them, and again, remember, you want to take a look at the reports as the best place. And on Hein Online, they put the reports lower down. I don't know why, because they're the most important. But this is how I would get to the reports. Oh, so there's the Senate report. So now, Hein Online is showing me the entries for the House and Senate reports for my search term. If your public law isn't on Hein Online, or if for any reason you don't have access to Hein Online, another possibility is ProQuest. I think it's more likely you'll find Hein Online than ProQuest, but ProQuest at one time was the state of the art. There's now, as I mentioned, a new product that has become the state of the art, but this is what a lot of places like Hofstra still has. So here at ProQuest Congressional, if we search legislative histories, and just warning, when you do this, if you do it at home, you will get an interim screen asking you for your ID number and password. It'll be asking you for credentials. You want to make sure to access ProQuest through the library website. Otherwise, you won't get that screen, and it'll tell you you need a login, and your login won't work. So just by way of reminder, this blue box is your friend on the home page of the library. Type in your database, ProQuest. And again, the link here on the right, not the name, but the link here on the right. And it's going to ask you to authenticate. This is what I mean. So your username, so your portal username, and your password. Come on. Please don't tell me on your assignment that you can't get to it. You can. So here back in ProQuest. And if you have trouble, the folks at the reference desk can ask you. You can email me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Or come visit me, whatever. Okay, so once we're in ProQuest, search for that all-important public law number. And then you choose your public law. And again, if you want to look at reports, you have the other types of documents here as well. And unfortunately, you have the same problem where you have to open each and every document in order to look at it to see if it is useful. So if we were interested in a report here, I'm trying to find this thing. So on ProQuest, eventually it will bring you to the report and you'll see PDF. And it opens up a PDF. And then you can do a search or Control F for your terms or for section by section analysis. And you see it brings you there. Okay. Any questions about the overall strategy? Quick or long? All-important public law number or chapter number? Credits? History? Historical and statutory notes? And then dive into the documents, whether it's a bill jacket for New York or compiled or other type of legislative history materials for federal. There, I just summed up the last 2 classes in 2 minutes. Seriously, if you have questions, there are law librarians who still get confused by this stuff. So this happens to be my favorite area, so I kind of like it. But if you are confused, don't feel like, oh my God, I shouldn't be confused. Please ask. Okay, I'm going to distribute the assignment. Actually, don't download the assignment until tomorrow because I have to update it. There was one change I made. This is the updated version I'm sending around now, but I will upload, actually I'll upload the new version after class. So wait till 8 p.m. tonight if you're that anxious to start on legislative history. No, I'm guessing you may not. Hopefully this all makes sense. Again, if it doesn't, please ask. Questions for New York, I think, are straightforward. The only part that may not be straightforward are the legislative history questions for federal, part 2. So I'm giving you your code sections already. And then I'm giving you which amendment you are interested in for that particular code section. For part 2 for federal, for questions 2 and 4, you're going to see a chart that should look familiar because that's the legislative history workshop we did last week and we'll finish up in a few minutes. Simplified though, I hope you'll be happy to hear. So for questions 2 through 4, as it says here, please put your answers in there and then you'll fill out the rest of the chart. Don't forget to answer questions 1, 5, and 6, which are not part of the chart. And honestly, if you fill out, if you put wherever you put your answers, as long as you put them somewhere, I'll find them. I'm good at that. Okay, so when you are filling out the chart, and that's really part B, I am suggesting that you look to see if the documents mention health claims. Don't spend a lot of time figuring this out. It's just to give you reference. So when you're looking at a whole list of hearings, if one hearing is from a tax committee and another hearing is from a health committee, list the hearing from the health committee. I'm not expecting you to look in the hearing and find health claims. C, you'll go to congress.gov, just like we just did. D, you'll go to Hein Online, just like we just did. And I'm asking you to find the public law listed here, just like we just did. And then do a search for health claims and food advertising. And then find the best documents for legislative intent research, just like we just discussed. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Now or for the next 2 weeks. Okay, those who still need to continue or finish your workshop for federal, please pull it out. Those who have already finished, you're welcome to hang out and work on your assignment, or if you'd rather call it a night, that's okay by me. I should, yes. Oh my God, I should have gone down here. I think depends on how much difficulty you have. Let's see how far you get.
Yes, but I'm a very...
I'm not sitting around here. Anybody have whiteout?